Hi guys, so this is Mr. Hardesty isn't here today, but if you're either absent today or if you're in his class, you'll be listening to me for today's lecture to fill in your notes. First thing, you need to take out your Fall of Rome activities if you have not already handed those in. And then instead of doing the writing here, would you rather be loved or feared as a ruler and why? Just go ahead and discuss that with your partners for a couple of minutes while we collect any missing homework, and then we can move on from there. So think about, would you rather be loved as a leader or feared as a leader, and why that would be? Go ahead. Okay, so today's lesson is leaving ancient Rome behind, leaving the Byzantine Empire behind, and jumping into what we call medieval Europe. And many of you probably already have some sort of notion as to what this time period is all about. Castles and knights and jokers and dragons and all other kinds of real and historical and not at all fictional things. But really what medieval Europe is all about is safety. And we'll see kind of how that happens, and we'll begin that journey today, but that's going to be the lead in for kind of the rest of this week. In the Middle Ages, which is the same time period that's going on here, it's also called medieval Europe, and it's also called the Dark Ages, as we'll see. There are three kind of distinct pieces. The first one is called the Early Middle Ages. During this time period, this is shortly after the fall of Rome, and so it's mass chaos all over Europe. Um, for the most part, you have lots of local leaders, but many of them are only in charge of maybe 10 or 100 or maybe as much as 1,000 people. Not huge areas and empires like Alexander the Great's, but much, much smaller areas that they're in control of. And we saw this kind of with the fall of the Roman empires. People, rich people especially, started to leave the cities and move to the country and start their own areas where they would have some people that they would be in charge of, and they had everything they needed there. So they didn't need to worry about trading with other people. They could just sit in one area and do what they needed to do in that one section. The High Middle Ages, because Middle Ages would sound stupid, lasts for about 300 years, and this is where we see that system where people have smaller areas of land and everyone lives there, start to develop into a much bigger economic and political system called feudalism. And again, feudalism is going to be the focus of our next couple of lessons. But we see this where you're in charge of a small piece of land and everyone lives on that land and takes care of each other there. This is also where we see the rise of the Roman Catholic Church. After Diocletian, guys who we didn't get to, Theodosius, and Constantine, we see the Roman Catholic Church, meaning Catholicism, Christianity, become the only real religion in the Roman Empire. Um, Not that it's the only one, but it's the largest one. We'll see Judaism and Islam come around during this time period or in the early Middle Ages as well. We'll get there. But for the focus of the High Middle Ages, it's really about the Catholic Church. And then the late Middle Ages is really more of a transitional period. So to move away from the first two periods, which are known as the Dark Ages. Just a side note, the idea of Dark Ages, you want to think about it this way. Think about a cartoon character gets an idea. Usually when that happens, you see a light bulb go off. Light equals learning. So Dark Ages would be the opposite of that. Um, and it's not that there isn't any learning going on, it's that the learning is very focused. It's not focused on what we would call cultural learning. Innovation, inventions to make people's lives better, the arts. It's about warfare. That's basically it. The learning during the Middle Ages time period is all about warfare. Well, in this transitional period, the late Middle Ages, we see that this is leading towards something called the Renaissance or the rebirth of cultural learning. And so this is where we see some of the most famous artists. We have our Ninja Turtle artists up here in the upper right-hand corner that take us through the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, where we see that cultural learning come about again. In the early Middle Ages, we have some early leaders that take over. The first one that we have on here is Clovis, and really the only thing that we need to concern ourselves with in terms of Clovis is it's shortly after the fall of Rome, and we see Christianity now spread from Italy up into what we would consider today modern-day France. And so it starts to spread north, and from this, Christianity will then expand even further thanks to Charlemagne. Charlemagne comes about 300 years later, and he takes over a much larger area of land. He unifies all of the Christian lands in Europe. So any land that practices Christianity, basically he becomes in charge of. And there are a variety of reasons for this. He lives for longer than most people do, and in fact, he's in charge. He's ruling over this for about the same time that most people live during this time period. He's really a warrior leader. He leads men into battle from about the age of 16, and so he's very well respected on the battlefield, and that leads to people respecting him as a leader as well. And we'll see kind of how that happens. But he's super tall. He's like 6'4". He goes down to the courts of biz and he's like dunking on people. And believe it or not, this is something that we have a tendency to look for in our leaders. Um, and we'll kind of hit on that. But here you have Charlemagne over here on the side, symbol of his um, being in charge of all the Christendom. You have the French fleur-de-lis symbol over here on the right-hand side. But this blue area on the map is the area that he controlled at its highest point. So here you have Italy and Rome, the Papal States, meaning they're very much belonging to what we would call today the Vatican, the capital of Catholicism. But he takes over all of this land and is in charge of the whole thing and really turns that land, much of which, especially up here, had been controlled by the barbaric tribes of Germany, and he turns that into a Christian land. So there are all kinds of things that make good leaders, and you guys can just have a minute or two to kind of discuss these now. Mentioned some of the different ideas about being a leader and this idea of being tall. George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, think about World's Strongest Man. The idea that you want to go to battle with these people. Think about a terrible movie called My Giant with George Mirasan. These movies, it has nothing to do with it, I'll be honest, but these ideas of people being tall and that leading to success is something that has been around for a very long time. Charlemagne has support in three main areas that are really important. Number one, politically. He treats these local leaders that he takes over with a lot of respect. Instead of trashing them and saying, all right, you're now our slaves, he says, listen, I'm going to leave you in charge, and in fact, I'm going to give you a little bit more land than you had before. But in return, I expect that you're going to be completely allegiant to me. You'll follow my orders, and then we'll make sure that everyone is successful together. It really kind of takes a cooperative approach to things, and this makes them respect him even more. The second area that he has support is militarily. Like I said, he's a warrior leader, so he fights right beside his men. He rewards his men when they do well. And in these first two cases, he's very much like Alexander the Great. And so he kind of takes some of these cues that Alexander used to make sure that the people that he ruled over respected him. And then finally, this is kind of a different way in which he has support, but it's support spiritually, meaning he has support of the main religion of Europe during this time period, the religion of Christianity. And we'll get into this more so later on, but Christianity and Catholicism are the same thing during this time period. There's only one Christian religion, and it's the religion of being Catholic. Today, there are all many different kinds of religions within this realm of Christianity: Lutherans, Baptists, Methodists, Unitarian. But during this time period, Christian and Catholic are the same thing. But the head of the Catholic Church, Pope Leo III, he gives Charlemagne the church's blessing. He says, listen, you promise to respect the church and fight for the church and make these groups Christian, and you will have the full support of the church. He essentially declares him like second in command in Christianity to him, similar to having the mandate from heaven or the divine right to rule. The gods have chosen Charlemagne to be our leader. And so just want you to think, you don't have to do this writing since we're short on time here, but which of the three areas do you think is the most important for a leader to have, and why? You can think of it Charlemagne, ancient times, or maybe think of it in contemporary times, meaning today's time period. What is more important for a leader to have? Support from the military, support from local leaders, or support from a particular religion? So give it some thought and just kind of chat about it. As we know, unfortunately, what goes up must come down. And eventually Charlemagne does die. Takes a while. Again, he reaches pretty old age. But just as with Alexander the Great's empire, the people who take over after him aren't strong enough to do what he did. They're not strong enough to keep everyone together. So this leads to a whole mess of chaos and confusion. So once again, we have this big empire and it breaks apart just like the Roman Empire did into all these different tiny pieces, and nobody is strong enough to keep them together. So these tiny pieces are all kind of against each other. There's nobody who is strong enough to unite them all together into Christianity, and so they break apart into these tiny pieces. And this makes things dangerous for them because when they're on their own, they're subject to violence from these barbaric tribes. And what we're talking about during this time period, the reason why they're called barbaric, or the term barbarian, today it means uncivilized or uncouth, like if you eat your food like Ralphie from A Christmas Story's brother. But back then it just meant not Christian. And so you have the Muslims, obviously not Christian, they practice the religion of Islam. North Africa and the Middle East, and if you took a close look at the map, you notice that they had control of Spain as well during this time period. And we'll get into the debate over the Holy Land, meaning the city of Jerusalem, between Jews, Christians, and Muslims that goes on during this time period. We have the Magyars from the Far East, today India, Pakistan, just like the Mongols and the Huns, very skilled on horseback. And then we have the Vikings from what is today Denmark and Norway, what we would call Scandinavia. Really, the term Viking is a job. It's kind of these warriors, these raiders, these pirates, but we would call the people Norse, N-O-R-S-E. They led raids on small town, and these three, but especially the Vikings in Northern Europe and Britain, created a lot of fear in people's minds. People were scared. Attacks were commonplace, and if you don't have a large group of people to defend you, it's going to make things really tough to feel comfortable living day to day. And so we have the symbols of Islam. We have some Viking symbols over here, Flavor Flav, and then the Magyars, this image over here on the left as well. And so all of this is meant to lead us into a discussion on feudalism, this system where people were in these small areas where they had everything they needed. Because you have these barbaric tribes coming in, and this is really, I kid you not, the most important part of today's lesson. People needed to band together for protection. They were scared. They needed to make sure they had enough food for just the people on their small little area, but you had these barbaric tribes. In addition, people from other small areas could come and attack you as well. And so the king would have this small amount of control, but he would try to provide protection for everyone who lived there as well. And so this political system called feudalism that we'll dive into a little bit more tomorrow, the purpose of it is to organize society and protect all of the members of that society, to make sure that everyone felt safe, to make sure that everybody would be able to live peacefully in that small area. Because it's really chaotic. There is not a whole lot of communication going on, so you weren't sure if somebody would come and attack you one day or the next, or anything like that. And so what we'd like you to do right now is take a minute on the bottom of your notes or a separate sheet of paper, 2 to 3 sentences. How do we get from the fall of the Roman Empire last week? How do we get from where this huge empire breaks apart into smaller pieces and then feudalism comes to be? And so you can absolutely use your notes, but you want to think of it as putting things in sequence. What happens to lead to the next thing, to lead to the next thing, to lead to the next thing, to eventually get us to where that political system called feudalism becomes necessary for people in order to live each day. So please go ahead and do that now to close out class today. And thank you guys for listening. If you have questions, you can always stop down and see me in my room if Mr. Hardesty isn't there.